Right, welcome everyone. As the attendees list starts to populate, we'll just wait for a minute or two before we kick off. It'll take usually kind of a minute for the attendees start to slowly creep in. It's always really nice to see familiar names in the attendees list and being able to say hello, but not getting any hello back. So Melanie, hello. Christy, hello. Farnaz, hello. I'm sure you're waving back at me in your own little cocoon. Okay, so just so that we can enjoy the talks and the presentations as long as possible, we'll kick this off and wait for more attendees to join in as they join in. So welcome to the AASA webinar platform. We're very kind of happy to see you if you're coming back, and if you're joining for the first time, welcome to this new platform that the AASA has kicked off this year. So just a little bit about the platform. The AASA wants to invite academics and researchers, professionals, whoever has anything interesting that they want to share with the world, really. And we're happy for the AASA to be used as a platform for you to share your knowledge and your work with the world. So if you are interested in doing this, please feel free to visit the AASA website and click on the AASA webinars link. And through that link, there's all the terms of reference, all the information that you need to get in touch with us and to make an application to submit your webinar proposal. And I've said this many times, but the best thing about this is that you get an honorarium, which is not usual in these cases. So I think that's why we've also been flooded with a lot of proposals, which is great. But that's all in the future. Let's live in the present. We would like to thank once again the fantastic Visualization Institute from UTS for being the first to really kick off this new webinar platform with their 3 webinar series on visualization in architecture and beyond. And I will let the moderator introduce this in more detail, but just to kick things off, this is the 3rd and last webinar in this series. And I'd like to introduce the moderator for today, Dr. Linda Matthews, co-director of the Visualization Institute and senior lecturer at the School of Architecture at the University of Technology, Sydney. Thanks again to all the Visualization Institute members, and to you, Linda, and to the other co-director, Andrew Johnston, and over to you.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'll just share my screen. So welcome, everybody. This is, as Mohammed said, the final in the series of visualization in architecture and beyond. So we've explored some very interesting fields. History and technology was a couple of weeks ago. You can find those on the AASA website. First of all, I would like to acknowledge, sorry, I'm just having a bit of lag here, acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which UTS stands, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So as Mohammed said, this is the final in the series, and the 2 speakers will be, I'll introduce them more fully in a second. Professor Gerard Reinmuth, who's a professor of practice at the University of Technology here in Sydney, and also the founding director of Terroir, the architectural practice, and Associate Professor Alex Munt, who's the Associate Professor of Media Arts and Production in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here as well. So first of all, I'll just say a few words. You probably already know this about the Visualization Institute, but we're a fairly recent implementation across the university, across a couple of, or more than a couple actually, several faculties now. We're expanding all the time. And we are a collaborative network of researchers and expert practitioners, and we work across data science, narrative design and technology. So what we're trying to do is coalesce the talents of existing talents of academics within the university, bring them together and make ourselves available to you and outward looking towards industry. So please get in touch with us if you feel that we can help in any way at all, because we do offer project-driven visualization, research and development to all staff who are interested. So please get in touch with us. Now I'll introduce you, so a bit of few words about our speakers. Professor Gerard Reinmuth is as I said, the founding director of the architectural practice Terroir and professor of practice at the School of Architecture here. He's actually a big researcher, and the intersection of these two domains is found in his ongoing writing and teaching practice with Professor Andrew Benjamin and towards a relational architecture. They've written several books together, so he's very knowledgeable in that field. Gerard's lecture, Playing Aikido with Computers, Defending Weak Intelligence from the Overwhelming Force of Computation, takes Ignacy de Solomon-Arle's characterization of design as dependent on weak intelligence as a departure point to reflect on the constant threat to this productive weakness over 25 years of architectural practice since the invention of 3D Studio Max. So our second speaker today is Alex Munt, who's the Associate Professor of Media Arts and Production at the University of Technology here. Alex is a creative, practice-focused artist and scholar across film and spatialized media, including cinematic virtual reality. He's a screenwriter and director, and his work has been exhibited, screened, and distributed in Australia and internationally. He also has a background in architecture and design. Alex's lecture, Cinema, the Art of Light, reflects on the cinematic tensions between interiority and exteriority, lightness and darkness, for a medium which only exists in the presence of light. So just running through how today will happen, we'll have a 20-minute presentation by Gerard, and following that, a 20-minute presentation by Alex, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. So please enter your Q&A in the Q&A portal, not in the chat room. So it will also be recorded and uploaded to the AASA website. So over to you.
Great, thanks, Linda. And thanks for the invitation. And also thanks, Alex. The nice thing about doing these talks is, of course, you meet other people you may not have already met. So as I said before, Linda, do keep the time thing going and give me a strong wave a few minutes before, because I'm keen to get to Alex's presentation, to be honest. So look, I to be honest, found this a bit intimidating to talk about, because with my university hat on, yes, there's this project about relationality and practice and redirecting practice in the current conditions we're in. And for whatever reason, visualization is not really part of that project. But of course, one runs a practice, so visualization is part of every project, and perhaps often left untheorized. And so this was actually a nice opportunity to reflect on this question of the role of visualization. And so as a practice that does a number of different things, as you said in the introduction, our practice was founded just after 3D Studio Max was invented. And I only mention that because it's a sort of time when what architects could do and what we could see change sort of radically. And it has, I think, had an impact on the profession. And so while these things were, of course, computation of various kinds was involved in the realization of all these things, the question is, of course, always the million question of what was the impact of them. Of course, we're in this golden era, it would seem, of visualization. And I think Anthony mentioned in his first lecture, the central image, I think it's a Doug and Wolf image of Crofy's scheme for the Powerhouse Museum. And there is this ability now, and it's great with Alex's talk coming next about cinema, because of course architects now learn so much from cinema to sort of create these worlds that literally make your heart leap and you sort of yearn to be in them. And so there's this incredible power to it. And I remember being a symposium with Bjarke Ingels about 10 years ago, the Danish architect director of BIG, and he was so excited by where this was going at the time, because of the power to sort of tell a story and or sell a story, if that makes sense. And of course, you know, decisions about spending enormous amounts of money are made on the back of sometimes looking at images such as this. And so understanding the incredible power of this, the question, I suppose, is when is it a productive power? When is it a power of distraction, let's say? Now, because, Linda, we are here for the AASA, but also for the Visualisation Institute, I thought I'd better just remind myself what it means to visualise. And of course, while in the context of previous images, one can say, okay, it's certainly making these arguments visible. You, of course, talk, and I think it's in the webinar, Tracy, about this perhaps harder definition in terms of unleashing the power of data and amplifying our ability to understand complexity, so on and so on. And so in mulling over that, I mulled over this image, which is incredibly important to me when I started studying, which is Bernard Sumi's diagrams for the Parc de la Villette in Paris, a simple diagram that talked about an amount of built stuff, an amount of verandas basically, and then the open air, and how he was going to reorganize those across the park. And it's one of the iconic images of this great era of diagramming in architecture. And of course, it's pre-digital, let's say. And so the question, and then from that, there's of course axonometric, and then the plan. And so you go, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about the power of data, amplifying ability to understand things. And of course, you have the sort of rhetorical power of these images and what they can do. You know, what else can we do, or what else might data visualization offer? In the previous context, we use these sort of rhetorical techniques in projects. So a combination of, sometimes you might say, cute iconography, a suitable amount of bar charts, a suitable amount of diagramming to convince people that certain things may or may not be real. When we don't know what the answer is, it becomes a sort of diagonal set of squiggles that look suitably technological and exciting to explain, in this case, the gap between clinical functions and a series of site conditions in a project in Denmark. The wheel on the right is another way of visualizing a series of concepts about a project. And in a lot of the urban work we do, which I'm sensing is where that phrase came from, of course, we have the power of just insane amounts of repetition. So of course, you can just map a site according to any number of factors or parameters, lay these things over the top of each other again to make all sorts of understanding. So of course, we have this incredible power at our disposal now, and it is very, very convincing. Of course, we do other forms of data visualization, as I alluded to before, bar charts and all sorts of things. We now have, of course, at hand demographic data that we can use to make arguments for projects. This is for a housing, diverse housing project, talking about demographic trends in Sydney. And of course, we have now at our hand the whole geospatial analysis tool set. So we can, of course, sweep context to understand or draw out any number of analyses, environmental analyses, network analyses. Now, things like the network analyses are, again, so powerful and so compelling. But what we never ever do is use these explorations as equations, if that makes sense, to result in a design. So we use them to find things out. And of course, I suppose our discomfort with a lot of the work done in the name of data is the idea that you plug a whole lot of stuff into an algorithm and the answer pops out and that's your project. And we operate quite differently. This is a very quick case study, the Penguin Parade in Victoria, a building you can see on the right in the knuckle of the peninsula. And in doing that project, we had a previous, like a reference design. And in winning the project, we had to reconsider and develop it. And we had a strong sense, because the way three landscapes come together, something to do with the progression from a car park. There's 4,000 people that come down to see the penguins. You have this scale exchange between 4,000 visitors and piles of cars and buses to you encountering a penguin, and the sort of beautiful thing about that. And we had a strong sense the building should be turned around. And the dilemma was the building was the previous, it was only a reference design, but still it was done by an Australian, very well-known architect who we respect enormously, gold medalist. And we had to sort of convince the board that we might want to change this thing. And one of the reasons we wanted to change it is we're worried a lot about the sort of potential of 4,000 people to occupy this in an unproductive way. And what I mean by that is the sense when you go to an airport, right? And they've got A to K, all the check-ins lined up in the international terminal. And all these people sort of arrive and then they sort of jam through border force, once you've all checked in. And we wanted to make it more of a journey. And the problem was it's very hard to convince people to be true. So what we did is started doing things. This is 4 years ago. We do a better job of it now. We rang some big engineers and put our claim to them. They said, look, you're probably right. But when you talk about this sort of visualization in a big engineering practice, the answer normally is, look, oh, it's very complicated. The model's very heavy. Ring us up in 3 weeks. It'll take 6 weeks and cost you $150,000. So we just put some dots on a piece of paper and sort of faked what it might be. So what we have is some network analysis that's actually sort of hand drawn. And then in the spirit of network analysis, you have, of course, this series of actors. You can embed the actors with certain qualities and certain powers. So we made different actors. These people have different roles. They might be employees or tourists or shoppers or whatever, and showed how, look at this. Here they are all crushed together. Here they are moving beautifully through the building. But this was all hand drawn. But the power of data visualization is so high. You can convince anyone of anything if it looks like a data visualization. So this is sort of an interesting thing, perhaps, to understand. In doing the building, we actually use all sorts of different visualizations, which I'll come back to. And of course, the visualizations that now are so well known, if you like, in architectural practice. These things that really try and capture the minds or hearts of a client as you're trying to convince them that what you're doing has value. The funny thing about these two different worlds, so the power of data and urban work and the complexity of making design decisions, can perhaps be summed up a little bit. And I love this quote of Lawrence Barth's in Charles's book, the experimental impulse of architecture versus the strategic demands of urbanism. Because of course, the experimental impulse of architecture, I think, requires a very different reflection, if you like, on how to use data. The reason I called the talk Playing Aikido with Computers is there is this funny thing about Aikido, which is a very soft one in terms of its philosophy and execution. And when I was sort of reading a bit about it again, refreshing myself for the talk, there's this great quote, which was, although it's a truly great martial art, you should never align it unless you really know what you're doing. And to me, that'd be the sort of big message, I think, about the use of data. It is so powerful. As I said, you can even fake data visualizations and have power at your disposal. You can invent power for yourself by just making it look like a data visualization. It is true. Look, the data says it. And of course, architects hover a lot between the two notes in grey, in a way. The medium is a message, but the amount of architects say, look, it's just a tool. It's just a tool. I'm doing my design, my project for a whole series of reasons. But of course, as we know, it's as Wills McLuhan tells us, it's not just that simple. There's a very old slide. I've got to turn off a very dodgy animation, for which I'm never be blighted because this is being recorded. When we started in 99, the modem was still screeching and you could send a sort of 1 kilobyte email probably. So we used faxes. So we used to design, because we have offices in different locations. Andrew Benjamin at the time said we're actually the first truly digital practice in the world, which of course was great for my ego and a very kind thing for him to say. I don't know if it was true, but what he was trying to get at is the practice, which was in multiple locations, couldn't exist without these technologies, because we would design via sending piece of paper backwards and forwards through the ether. And this eventually came to emails, and then inspired by Marco Frascari, the great writer about Carlo Scarpa's work, and very involved in thoughts about the drawing. His big research project was the sort of beautiful drawing, the marks left on the drawing, incredibly manual project. He was an early adopter of the Toshiba tablet PC or tablet laptop. And it was like The Exorcist. The screen would come up and then it would sort of rotate and then flip back down again and become a tablet. And so we use these things to sort of digitize our collaboration. And in doing that, the reason the hand kept being involved was because the project, and these are slides literally from a lecture in 2004, the way we make projects is really to talk about things, to talk about typological precedents and of course register them, to talk about allegorical references, to talk about the problem of seeing, and bring these things together in a sort of cloud. And from that discussion, these words and conversations start to make things, and they tend to start to make things, at least in our practice, in the sort of generation of lines on a site, and the lines eventually thicken, eventually become models and become a project. And this process of line work and the use of, if you like, line work to thicken up as per the Giacometti sketch into a project. And as we're doing that, always to include other work by other practices. It could be paintings, artworks. Here's a Friedrich painting that was very central in this project outside AASA in Hobart. Photographs, and trying to work out, can you make that Bill Henson photograph a spatial project? Other architectural works. And then beyond, let's say, any sense of formal likeness, perhaps just dealing with emotional power. So can you create a project that has the power of this painting? Can you create a project that does that to you when you are in it? And we've never really understood how that is made possible, or could be made possible, if you like, through data visualization, partly because the project's always changing. So just when we think we've done this building, this is the penguins building before, someone starts talking about penguin sort of feathers and how they work and how that might influence the building. So there's this sort of constant sort of feeding the project, relying heavily on intuition and your ability of your mind to associate many, many complex things with each other. Now, in this project, also done at the time, again, very early 2000s, because in starting the practice and thinking about computation, there was a heavy sort of emphasis at the time. Going through the same process, we at the time working with a young graduate, a guy, Adrian LaHood, who's now actually the dean of the RCA. And he was very good at 3D Studio Max, and he did these images. And the right-hand one has this sort of reflectivity, transparency thing going. And what he was trying to do in that right-hand image, again, circa 2001 or 2, was trying to capture the quality of this overlapping of lines, the sense that even though it was made of concrete, you somehow sense there was something else there, you could almost see through it. And we started to think, there's something about the way we design and the way we're trying to work through this complexity that these sort of images can help with. So they're not, let's say, Doug and Wolf type renders of the thing, but they're almost test stopped halfway before there's too much detail, and with an incredible, let's say, artistic license. This project, which was an old Bushell's warehouse down at the Rocks, we had to do a renovation of it. It has a sort of central lift core and things. And of course, there's a heritage building. It has this very impenetrable exterior. And we started thinking about the power of that image on the right. And so then started doing renders of the building where we'd start to make the building disappear. And then we could understand the foyer, which was part of the project. It's a little bit on the right here. How the foyer was in a way a bridge from the street to the lift core. And this understanding wouldn't have been possible unless we'd actually been able to use visualization to sort of remake the project in our mind, if that makes sense, and re-understand something about it through the sort of distortions one can make with these tools. Landscape's always important in our work, and having buildings in a way fold the landscape into it, you might say. And so again, at the time, there was a house we were doing, and there was this sort of particular landform, and we started mulling over, again, sort of manually, you would say, in Photoshop, how we can sort of have a house that sort of responds to the sort of power of this landscape, and by almost bending around the power of the landscape. And then as what we'd always do lots of options, lots of iterations, model after model after model after model. And of course, then we realized, we could also use animation. And so starting to sort of start with an A and a B, and, you could decide to stop around here, partway through the animation and go, okay, I think something about that. Again, a total intuitive judgment at that point, because there's not a performance criteria attached to these things in a, let's say, literal or hard technical sense. All these thoughts were happening in parallel with an observation that's been very profound in nearly all my work since, which was the evolution of Coop Himmelblau, who, before I was born, were doing these things in the streets of Vienna, the Restless Sphere project. As I started architecture, this building we'd done a few years before, and this is the representations they were using, an incredibly powerful project that talked about the wall coming down, some of the questions around dealing with heritage and transformation and rebuilding buildings. And by the time they'd got to the mid-2000s, this practice that were effectively activists on the streets of Vienna and Bubbles were then working for BMW, doing the new sales centre in the south of Germany. And of course, these things were possible because they had this incredible, this is like cutting edge visualization 2006, which is interesting to reflect on given what we can do now. And there's something highly disturbing to me about this, which is a lecture in itself, given the fact that this project is effectively, you know, the ultimate sort of neoliberal project, you might say. You know, it's a place where people can feel very good about themselves having bought a BMW, and it's a sort of monument to this act of consumption. And the question I was asked was, what role has visualization had in this? Because it's allowed them to do this thing. It's of course tied to computer models that deal with, of course, all the element analysis and formatting of the structure and so on. But there's something about visualization. I suppose we started asking ourselves, is visualization evil? You know, is this where we're all going to end up? What does this mean? Now we can draw and render anything. So at the time, Sarah Benton, who was the sort of design right hand, you'd say at the time in the office, a graduate architect, we were doing a work in invitational stream at RMIT, and SciAL was doing some ARC work, linkage grants with practice. And there were 4 practices and we were one selected for it. And Sarah did this PhD. This is just her research questions on the right and the PhD sort of structure on the left. And as the designer in the office, as we were literally discovering to use tools, but also as these tools were being made themselves, again, keeping in context the early 2000s, did a whole PhD on what we might do about this in the future. And of course, an embedded PhD has a very complex relationship with its host. So to this day, I'm interested to talk to Sarah about it again now. Of course, our views are very influential, which would say was a slight cynicism about perhaps too much technology, about technology stealing from us our intuition and our brains, if that makes sense, our power to make free associations. And it was a very interesting piece of work, and it was via project. And yeah, she did all sorts of things one does in a research of this type. So it's effectively a sort of, active project. So documenting all the software we had, where it was used at certain points in projects and so on, and sort of trying to set up almost a theory of software for the practice. And one project, and if Linda, if you've appeared, have we got about 2 minutes to go? How's that? Perfect.
Yep, a couple of minutes.
Oh, good. A project at that time, they might say was indicative of that, was this one, which was for the National Library in Prague. And there's a site on a sort of old parade ground, the site being the White Square. And we did the things we do in the laptops, again, doodling with these fat pens. Then she started modeling these things. We could see them, tracing these lines, and so on and so on. So one went through a sort of process. Then we'd introduce a painting. Then we build a model of the painting, because then we'd try and work out if the model of the painting could help us understand the project. And then someone talked about laying velvet over the site and scrunching a corner of a piece of velvet. So that was sort of done. And something wasn't quite right. And so then we go back and actually scrunch a piece of fabric in real life and sort of email it to each other. So there's this funny freestyle relation between when the technology was working and when manual needed to work to eventually result in a project. And this, in a way, you might say, set up a way of working which probably persists to this day to some extent, of sort of dipping in and out of the various tools on offer. And of course, the wisdom we need when one's considering this many things in this project, this many emails, this strain, there's like the sort of, perhaps a horror of an architect's mind on the left, and the sort of communications on the right. And so I think when the practice is working at its best, it's when it's incredibly mindful about when one reaches a sort of dead end with the technology, or when all being mindful about one reaches a dead end with something one's doing manually, and one tool or other would help. So one ends up in contemporary practice with this holster full of equipment, all sorts of softwares one can deploy to help one out in the right circumstances. So our preferred relation between visualization and the design process might be secondary, supportive, supplementary, because at this point we still, let's say, insist on that power of our mind to make these associations, you'll say. So I'll stop there, because that's 20 minutes.
Thanks, Gerard. That was fascinating. I completely lost track of time for a while there, particularly when the Caspar David Friedrich came on. Really wonderful lecture. Thank you. I think we've completely dispensed with data visualization at this point, but I'll hand over
Thanks,
On
Linda.
that note.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Gerard. And I think we shared a Skype, which we talked a little bit about. I like the word you used, discomfort. And we talked a little bit about the discomfort of visualization. And we also talked about, is that okay being from the Visualisation Institute to address this? And I think it absolutely is. Yeah. I saw that image you had of the people in the ball, and I thought, some mind clicked. I thought, is that the Beatles? And I thought, no, but it was the time zone. Anyway, so I'm starting with a quote from George Harrison. Yes, actually, no, I am going to start with the universe, which I think is a good place to start a 15-minute talk. I was reading Wired, and there was this recent article in Scientific American. There was a physicist called Avi Loeb. His speculation was, what if the universe was cooked up in a lab by aliens as a more advanced life form, kind of like a baby universe or a kind of test tube universe? And it was kind of interesting. I thought, wow, what does that mean? And basically the idea behind that is that if humans were the subject of that basic experiment, we got a C, or even worse, we got a D, which is like a fail. And really what he was saying that is, as a species, we have no way to recreate the habitable conditions on our planet when our sun dies. So that's an interesting proposition to begin a talk about light. I think so. This is just a random collection of things, actually. So it's like a collage, and these things may not all unite, but I hope some of them do. The next thing I was thinking about, Chris Marker's film, Sans Soleil, 1983 essay film, or Sunless. The title is taken from a Russian composer from the Romantic period, and the cycle of song called Sunless, which is connected to death. So this idea about sunlessness and death, is it's connected in poetry, literature, cinema, and science, is I think something which is actually connected to this discussion we're kind of having today about visualization. We often think that cinema was invented outside in the sun, and to a degree it was. We can think about the Lumiere brothers. A train arrives at a station, or we can think about 100 workers leaving a factory. And so it's Mark Cousins, the film historian, reminds us that cinema was born non-narrative and also non-industrial. The Lumiere brothers also said at the time that cinema was an invention without a future, which is also an interesting idea I'm willing to return to. Later on, to mark 100 years of cinema, the German artist and filmmaker Harun Farocki created a multi-channel remix, and it was basically this idea of recreating the work the Lumiere's workers leave the factory, and he used all kind of media as you do in kind of a remix. One thing he found interesting in a particular kind of media, and it was in advertising media, is there are barely any shots of workers leaving workplaces, okay, of any kind of variety. And it's kind of interesting to think about that as a particular visualization as well. He talked about the invisibility or the lack of visualization in this, in terms of, and what he said is that the dread of factory work is second to only the dread of representing death in commercial media. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Cinema was actually conceived as an interior. So this was 2 years prior than the train arrived at the station, then those workers left the factory. A film studio designed by Thomas Edison. And this is called the Black Maria, a black studio box. It's built in New Jersey. And really interesting, this was designed to chase the sun. So it's kind of like a lazy Susan. So you can see on the image there, you can see the turntable there at which the building rotates. So this idea in Mark Cousins, again, it's got this great, there's a book and then it's also a series as well, The Story of Film. And this is the point which he basically says that cinema announced itself as an art of light. So when cinema moves inside, there's a transition there, and it's an important transition because it becomes less about capturing real moments, authentic moments, and more about recreating imagined ones in virtual light, not in sunlight. Some of the films filmed in the Black Maria, two people kissing, a very human activity, and also kittens playing. We could fast forward to TikTok to see the convergence of those ideas. Okay, cut forward to 20 years, 1920s, 1930s, the film studios were built. They also chased the sun. So whilst film might have been invented in the East Coast, it soon went to Hollywood and California. still funded by Wall Street. But the imagination of working class Jewish businessmen in the most part, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, and so on. And what was the studio? The studio took the Edison idea, and it was about a vampiric kind of black box approach, and what the art was to exclude all daylight altogether. In other words, it's about a level of control. This is actually from a German production, a German studio, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1919. And this is kind of an interesting moment where light and shadows were actually painted onto the set. And I think this is kind of interesting because it's kind of like a prelude to the sunlessness in a way. And I'll be speaking a little bit about some of the tools of cinema and our current tools of cinema, to follow on from Gerard around virtual production, which our colleague Ian Thompson talked about in webinar 2 of this series as well. So this idea about, it's kind of like I like this idea of 1919 is a prelude to what's to come 100 years later. A couple of other examples from film history, and sorry, I'm covering a very broad term here. In the 1960s, Jean-Luc Godard was famous for exploiting the sun, the natural light of the Champs-Élysées in his film Breathless. Not long after that, he made a studio film called A Woman is a Woman in 1961, but he demanded that the set was built with real ceilings, so the actors couldn't be lit from above like his normal studio practice. And in this sense, I think Godard is calling out the anxiety of cinema and light and that relationship as it's progressed in the medium. A word on perception, and obviously visualization and perception go hand in hand. When cinema arrived in the late 19th century, the visual culture of the West has fairly consolidated or completely consolidated in a sense. People have been making images, let's not forget, for 20,000 years. Cave painting of LaSalle here. There's a really good book by David Hockney called The History of Pictures, written with Martin Gayford. And in that book, he talks about mediums of convergence, not as a break or a rupture, but really as a continuity. And photography from around 1827, he sees that not as a rival as painting, but rather a chance to fix on paper through a negative and through a chemical process, an image was painted as already known for a very long time, at least since the invention of perspective in the Renaissance. Another thing which caught my eye recently was in the State of Cinema address by French film auteur Olivier Assayas. He describes the cinema as a miracle of reproduction, and cinema, and in a sense, cinema and architecture are united in this sense, in this holistic desire to represent a realistic reproduction of the world as a whole. So this sort of miracle of reproduction which cinema seeks, which is the ultimate quest of cinema, enfolding and embracing arts within it. It translated from this talk, obviously in French and English, he talks about this idea of the texture of cinema, which I thought is really, really interesting. And I think this is, for me as a practitioner, this is related into practice, is that what Olivier Assayas says here, it's the material and practical concerns of cinema which deliver thought in motion. So in the sense of the lensing you use, the kind of camera movement and so on. So these practices form the texture of cinema. This is a shot from After May, 2013 movie by Assayas. And in this movie, he captures the texture of the radical 1970s. He talks about his relationship with Guy Debord, the Situationists, in his own memoir. But also, it's interesting that radical history is couched within a wider history of representation and the history of visualization. During COVID, I purchased the book Atmospheres by Peter Zumthor online shopping, and that the title just sort of seemed right. To go with a nice little brown book with a Hessian kind of texture to it. Most people would know that here better than me. Anyway, he talks about materiality, and it's a treatise of different things of practice. And he almost forgets light until the very end when he recuperates it. And he talks about, and he's got this quote in there, which I thought actually got me thinking about this presentation. Thinking about daylight and artificial light, I have to admit that daylight, the light on things, is so moving to me that I feel it is almost a spiritual quality. When the sun comes up in the morning, it doesn't feel as if it quite belongs in this world. It gives me a feeling there's something beyond me, something beyond my understanding. And this is kind of interesting. And you know, knowing a little bit about his work, perhaps it's architectural porn, but his kitchen I've seen on Instagram, I think it's this incredibly, the level of fenestration in this room, which is a utility room, is quite striking for a domestic space. But it's also a commitment to light, and yet still it doesn't move and rotate like Edison's Black Maria. In terms of thinking about spirituality in cinema, Terrence Malick is a filmmaker who privileges the exterior, who privileges the sun. In his movie, The Tree of Life, the camera, he works with Emmanuel Lubetsky. The camera follows the actors with short focal lengths. It's handheld or it's on a steady cam. The cinematographer says he likes to shoot multiple perspectives of the same emotion, which is like a painting, like cubism. So again, this overlapping bounds of representation. And also these images are from childhood in this movie, and they're sort of they're a reflection on the filmmaker's own childhood in Texas, but also they're generic. They're those representations which become anybody or everybody's childhood. And it also gets me thinking that today, you know, the lives of our children are probably lit by cool blue LEDs more than sunlight or just as much as. Also about the practices of filmmaking. Terrence Malick shoots at magic hour, which is 20 minutes either of the sun rising or the sun setting. The pressure of getting that shot, can you imagine, with a certain number of crew and the actors getting the lines right, and so on. Seems at odds with the passivity of many the tools of digital culture which we have today. The other thing, thinking about texture, light, and the cinematic image, is the work of French director Lais Carax. In Polar X, he's got the main character, Pierre, who's played by Guillaume Depardieu. He either meets or dreams of a mysterious dark-haired woman who seems to be an Eastern European war refugee. They walk through the forest, and it's this scene which it would be kind of non-existent in commercial or industrial filmmaking, particularly in Hollywood, where it's a long scene, it's a single shot, there's no editing, and they just walk through the forest. It's the absence of light. Carax and his cinematographer Eric Gautier film it in pitch black. A denial of light. And I think this also gets me to think to return to Zumthor. And in this book, I read the line, he had an advice to architects, and he says, plan the building as a pure mass of shadow, and then only afterwards put the light in as if you were hollowing out the darkness. And I thought that's an interesting thing for what you're doing in cinema sometime. If we think of the exposing of a negative, or now a computer chip starts in blackness, and it's only with you add light that you start hollowing out the image, start visualizing, start representing. The other, so if we started with the universe, wanted to end up with Star Wars, of course, and this also is in sync with some of the ideas about virtual production technology that we have. There's a short clip on the making of The Mandalorian on YouTube. We can see these video walls. You can see not just a new way of filming, a really new way of filmmaking. The set lights itself. The set also lights the actors, and so on. It struck me as interesting in thinking about this talk and thinking about light and cinema and space in general, is that the director talks about the luxury of having a 4-hour sunset. You can see in this image is one of these sunsets. So pragmatism reigns. There's no doubt that's pragmatic, but you know, what is the cost of that? And what is the grace of cinema? What is it to see sunlight strike a human face and expose an image? What's this cost of the transformation in human perception, which shifts, you know, ever slowly with the wheel of time? On that note, I wanted to end up with this idea of synthetic cinema. There's a film academic and theorist in the States called Winston Wheeler Dixon, and this for me is sort of like an endgame of materiality for cinema. He talks about the marvelization of the world, including Mandalorian, as a new age of synthetic cinema. Somewhat pessimistic, but if we track this, 15-minute history here, the Lumiere brothers film the actualities captured in sun, captured these authentic moments of people's real lives. And with this pessimism, Wheeler Dixon talks about the new cinema, or the synthetic cinema, as a reliable conveyor belt of images that have no genuine existence in the service of narratives that offer no assistance to our off-screen lives. So it's kind of interesting to locate this technology within a wider kind of history. It's not to say that Hollywood isn't everything, and there's also adventurous. There's a counter history or an alternative history around filmmakers working sort of green screen or these sort of virtualized projects. Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart, or the late films of Eric Romer, shot in Green Screen Studios as well. So listen, I really do want to leave some time for a chat, and I'm wary of that. But I guess, yeah, interesting. It's kind of, in some way, I guess I'd like to pitch the idea that some of these technologies and these new sunless technologies are really potentially, an apocalypse of cinema. If the sun does go down, if we are a lab experiment with aliens in total and we haven't worked out how to reinvent our sun or get another one, in a sense, the film studios can go on. As long as we've got electricity, these films can be made. Okay, so thank you.
Great, that was great. Thank you so much, Alex. Really
Excellent.
Super interesting. It was sort of, I can't see any questions at the moment, but I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A portal and send them through. I'm just going to kick off because it just seems to me that both of you have a sort of hesitation around visualization, and it's actually its appropriateness for really conveying the sort of materiality and visceral qualities of the sorts of fields that you're in. And certainly, Gerard, first of all, it's a question to both of you ultimately, but firstly to Gerard, do you think there's a lot is lost these days in the sort of huge reliance on those sorts of data visualization tools like the Doug and Wolf? And in the same question, I would say, is there a certain sort of lack of authenticity or lying going on that is a little bit about architectural responsibility? So I've asked about 6 questions in one, sorry, but it's about authenticity and responsibility, I suppose, as well as loss.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's an interesting question because everyone finds it incredibly captivating to work in that medium, and it becomes part of the design testing process, right? So at some point in any project, let's say the render becomes part of the project, if that makes sense as well. And so
Yeah.
of course, it becomes part of what you deliver. And so it's actually, and so like someone like Anita in our office, who I think actually might even be here, who works in that field, becomes very much a key part of the sort of feedback loop, because it's at a certain point you are testing things, if that makes sense. What happens if that's timber? What does this mean? Or what does that mean? I think the dilemma we always have, and it's probably actually a self-critique rather than, of course, a technology critique. It's just like too much cake. Just keep eating. It's like, show me what this looks like, show me what that looks like. And the question we always have to remind ourselves of, in part so we don't send the people working with us completely mad through being asked to do numerous options, is what are our evaluation criteria? And so the dilemma is, I think, and I thought the Mandalorian stuff strangely tied into this very well, because in the end, when you can render anything and do anything, the design process does dissolve, I think, in every office now at some point, to someone looking at 8 or 10 versions on a wall of this thing. And it becomes like choosing, do I like pink or do I like yellow? Like, what's my favorite color this week? And so the question for us is always, I think you might say perhaps it's our age, perhaps the digital natives will operate differently, but there's a need for us to always come back into the real as a way of forcing us, almost like a therapeutic thing, if that makes sense, to force us to rethink, not necessarily about that real thing, but just what are the grounds of evaluation? And somehow grabbing back into the real just shakes us out of the tunnel one can get in, just cycling through, numerous options and just making, let's call it, very formal decisions. And of course, the dilemma with the model, just perhaps as a sidebar on that, well, the question of the model becomes important because visualization only gives you one perspective. And yes, you can zoom out, you can look at the model on the screen. But when Sarah was doing her PhD stuff, they actually got somebody in from Queensland, a sort of neuroscientist or somebody, who talked about what the brain does, and they've done all these MRI scans, right, of what happens when the brain looks at a picture versus when it looks at a 3D thing. And of course, when you hold a model in your hand, there's a fuller command of your senses and your critical faculties are in play than when you're just looking at a screen.
Mm.
So you could have a model of a building on a screen or a model of a building in your hand. And someone would say, as they would say to us in the office, oh, it's the same. What's your problem? You just need to learn the widget. And it's like, yeah, but something else happens when you're holding it.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Gerard, is about, we mentioned that Mandalorian example, but more isn't always better. So again, you have the digital sunset, you can film out forever if you like. But I wonder with creative choices and creative practices that some of those limitations of the real world, and light is one of our limitations. It comes and it goes. There's this kind of there's a commitment there, which in a more virtualized light scenario, you don't really need to give that commitment. And how does that affect the representation? I think it's sort of interesting.
Yes, indeed. So the hand is always at the center of practice at some point, the physical hand.
Yeah, I just had a question from Andrew. Hello, Andrew. Pragmatism. Do you have any thoughts about how filmmakers are likely to explore things that are non-pragmatic? Will they find limits and the constraints and play with them? Yeah, I think that is interesting. And at the end of that talk, I tried to say that, listen, these technologies always have a counter history, and Hollywood, or which is industrial film production at the zenith. There are always these kind of experiments. I think one. I guess I'd picture that is that, well, what's the capacity for darkness with these technology? What's the capacity for not having these lights on or having not many of them on? And I think that given that the medium is literally owes its existence to light, I think there's a lot of playful things that might happen there. And it's probably going to come from artists moving images, and I said more of the auteurs and people and so
on. I can't see any other questions at the moment. I do have another question for Gerard, which is, I just noticed that a lot of when you're showing images of your built works, that they have quite particular lines to them, and that they seem to emerge from a particular style of drawing, even a sort of a craft style like origami. So the lines are have very strong intersections and points of juncture. So how would you place that within visualization? What was the way that you're thinking about architecture influenced by any particular mode of visualization that came to bring you to that sort of outcome?
Look, I think it becomes Terroir. You end up telling a sort of creation story of sorts, but the practice was founded by 3 Tasmanians, and Tasmanian Gothic exists for a reason in literature and art and other and because there's a quality of light, there's a quality of the landscape, there's a rhythm to walking around in the landscape. So of course this is something we reflected on after that. There's something about the way we're organizing space, which it's close as Anderson is probably the national park tracks built in this Tasmanian National Park, the wooden tracks that just find their way around things. That makes sense. And sometimes present you with things. And of course, in coming from that landscape and that place, as you can see, we sort of tapped into a very particular tradition within art, if that makes sense. And, there's a sort of, great book, which the title just escaped me, but it sort of tracks the sort of work of Friedrich and others in Europe through to Rothko, the sort of the question of this line of sort of abstract expressionism, if that makes sense, but sort of starting in some of those pictures. And of course, what's interesting about, say, Friedrich's work is there's both the power of landscape, but at times a very particular precision about the way they use light. And so if you sort of put those 2 things together, you would say, well, when we came to visualizations, the question, and still, of course, when we're doing visualization work in the office, we tend to use paintings as the reference images, so someone's there, they're rendering a building for presentation to a client, and you're saying, just look at the sky and that Turner. I think that becomes the sort of discussion you have,
Yes.
strange enough. So I think, I suppose what we've tried to do, it's probably anyone doing anything creative, is you're trying to understand yourself better, and your world better, if that makes sense. So I mean, necessarily it's understanding oneself in a totally narcissistic sense. I mean, understanding the world you're in, and the world we're in, or the world we came through. What's a world where, particular forms of painting, particular literature. So when we're doing images, there again, when we're operating at our best, we go to those. But as I said, the dilemma we have, and it's again, it's always a self-critique, is one just gets distracted in front of bright things. You sort of find yourself spending weeks going, oh, look at this, it's amazing. Then you realize 2 weeks later, I've forgotten who I am. I need to now wind back again.
I was going to ask you, Gerard, I know we're running out of time there, but do you sometimes look at paintings for color as well, or was it more just form, which you're looking at these sort of historical representations or contemporary representations?
Nearly always light and, let's say, relation between things. So Hammershøi is another great one. The Danish painter in Christianity, like, there'll always be someone at a window, and it's just all about light and this sort of suburban reality. The way obviously the Friedrich stuff's very powerful. It's like classic sort of high German stuff.
We do have another question. Sorry to interrupt you, Gerard.
No, don't.
Do you think it's dangerous? It's from Zane. Do you think it's dangerous that big budget visualizations can distort the perception of a project, especially when pitching an idea against others without the same production value?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. And this is my almost favourite practice for visualization at the moment is in Sydney is Durbach Block Jaggers. And I know them very well for 25 years or so, but I was remarking to someone the other day, they're sort of just almost becoming the best version of themselves at the moment. I'd actually ask everyone just to look on Instagram at Durbach Block Jaggers, because they have a particular form of visualization that comes from Neil and Camilla's watercolor painting, actually, which has an antecedent in architecture from people like Stephen Hall. And now using, let's say, digital tools, they started to, and I'll say very manual digital tools, if that makes sense. It's sort of like, a bit of Illustrator. And they've created a sort of version of these watercolor pictures. So you'd almost say production costs are probably zero in terms of the computation, but the skill level is very, very high. And it's been very interesting to watch them now do more and more, let's say, commercial work and bigger work. What their visualizations do is in a way what the architectural sketch perhaps used to do, which is there was enough information to convey something, but equally enough information that the person looking at the image had to sort of complete the picture, if that makes sense. So there's this sort of space. Whereas, of course, what the let's say the big end visualization stuff does is literally can create reality. And you do have that situation, where one of the other slides I had was a building of ours, and it wasn't even a particularly great visualization project. But sometimes I'm putting slideshows together and I can't tell if it's the building or the visualization. You know what I mean? So you do have this dilemma now. So I think, look, I'd say the question is in a way 100% correct, and it's also the answer. There's this total dilemma now, and of course, it's almost become a sport to sort of look at visualizations and look at the building 4 years later and just go, oh my goodness, they've thought they're buying that, they're buying that, and that in itself then becomes a whole question, of course. And that's, I think, what I was trying to reinforce was in our sort of fake network project. It's so powerful. The medium is so powerful and it's so convincing. And you could say that comes with its own responsibility as well. But I think it also means in practice, one has to take a position simply in regard to that work, because it is just so powerful. But answer is yes, it's a problem, because if you don't have an incredibly fast, incredibly huge computer and piles of software, you can't. The argument is you can't compete, and then you look at something like Durbach Block Jaggers and go, oh no, it's all okay. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Look, I'm just mindful of the time. It's now 3 o'clock, and I know Martha wants to say a few words. Hi, Martha.
Hi.
Thank you both for really fascinating speaking, and I just wish it had gone on for much longer, really. That's the trouble with these hours. They go very quickly. So I'll hand over to you, Martha. And I just before I do, I'll say thank you to AASA for hosting this series. We have really enjoyed it. It's been incredibly stimulating. So thank you again.
Well, if you ever think about having another one, just send me a proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly, we are going to have another webinar. This time, the topic will be the climate action in architecture education. The registration will be open next Friday, so we'll have that on our website. And then the webinar is actually going to be launched on the Friday, the 12th of November. So just watch that space. It'll be really interesting. It's about climate action. I think that's everything. Is there any more questions or anything before we closing? No? Okay, thank you so much, everyone. It's been really enjoyable having you all here. And obviously, this is a platform that AASA use to engage with researchers and practitioners. So we'll look forward to meeting you very soon. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks.
Good to see you again, Alex. Thanks,
Yeah.
Linda.
Yeah, see you, Gerard.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Gerard.
Thanks, Linda.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Alex.
Martha. Okay, bye.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.